The message came while I was reconciling numbers that had never once betrayed me. The glow of my laptop filled the kitchen, spreadsheets open, the familiar comfort of order and balance wrapping around me like a habit I didn't realize had become my identity. Then my phone vibrated. One short vibration. I didn't rush to pick it up. I never rushed anymore. But when I glanced at the screen and saw my father's name, something in my chest tightened before my mind could catch up. "Don't come to your sister's wedding. She doesn't want to see you." I read it once, then again. Then a third time, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. There was no explanation, no apology, no softening sentence afterward. Just a closed door delivered in 12 words. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry, not right away. What I felt was emptiness, the kind that comes when something you assumed was permanent quietly disappears. My first instinct was to call him, my second was to text my sister. Both impulses died just as quickly as they appeared, because beneath the shock was a colder realization settling in. This message didn't sound like my father. It sounded like a decision that had been discussed, agreed upon, and delivered once my presence was no longer needed. I set the phone face down on the counter and went back to my laptop, staring at the numbers that suddenly felt heavier than they ever had before. I am the older daughter. I have always been the older daughter, not just by birth order, but by function. At 33, I could trace my adulthood back to the year my mother died, because that was the moment everything rearranged itself around me. Grief didn't arrive as tears or screaming or dramatic collapse. It arrived as responsibility. Someone had to make sure the mortgage was paid. Someone had to make sure my younger sister stayed in school. Someone had to keep my father from drowning in paperwork he didn't understand, and decisions he didn't want to make. That someone became me without a conversation, without a vote, without a ceremony marking the transfer of weight. I didn't resent it then. I told myself families worked that way. When one person fell, another stepped in. When my mother was alive, she had been the organizer, the planner, the quiet engine that kept everything moving. After she was gone, that role didn't disappear. It simply moved into my hands. I had a job I liked back then. Not glamorous, but promising. I was building something for myself, or at least I thought I was. I told my supervisor I needed flexibility. I turned down a promotion that would have required travel. I moved closer to home. Each decision felt temporary at the time, just until things stabilized, just until my sister graduated, just until my father found his footing again. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when everyone around you benefits from it. By the time my sister finished college, the system was already built. Family accounts, automatic transfers, a small business my father technically owned but never truly ran. I handled payroll, taxes, contracts. I didn't call myself controlling. I called myself careful. Someone had to be. Money doesn't forgive confusion or good intentions. It demands attention, and I gave it mine. For a long time, things worked. We weren't rich, but we were steady. Bills got paid, emergencies were handled before they became disasters. My sister lived her life without ever needing to worry about where the money came from, and my father grew comfortable in the belief that everything would somehow be fine. I didn't mind that either. Stability was my contribution. I didn't need applause for it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It arrived quietly, disguised as happiness. My sister met someone. She called me one night, her voice brighter than it had been in years, and told me she was in love. I was genuinely happy for her. I wanted that for her. A life that wasn't weighed down by loss and responsibility the way mine had been. When I met him, I didn't dislike him. That's important to say. He was polite, attentive. He asked questions about our family with a curiosity that felt flattering at first. He wanted to know how long we'd lived in the house, how the business started, how my father managed after my mother passed. I answered without suspicion. Why wouldn't I? He was going to be family. But something subtle began to change. Decisions started being made without me. Small ones at first, dates chosen. plans discussed after the fact. I noticed I was being informed rather than consulted, but I told myself that was normal. My sister was building her own life. She didn't need my approval for everything. I reminded myself not to confuse support with control. Then came the wedding planning. I wasn't asked to help. I wasn't asked not to help either. I was simply absent. Emails circulated that I wasn't copied on. Conversations happened that I heard about later. When I asked gentle questions, the answers were vague. "We've got it covered. Don't worry. It's handled." Handled by whom, I wondered, but I didn't push. The message from my father arrived 2 weeks after I realized I hadn't seen a single invoice. Standing in my kitchen that night, the house silent around me, I let myself replay the text one more time. "Don't come. She doesn't want to see you." It wasn't the exclusion that hurt the most. It was the delivery. The way years of contribution could be dismissed without explanation, as if I were a guest who had overstayed rather than the person who had held everything together. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace, all the times I had absorbed stress so no one else had to, all the choices I had made under the assumption that family meant permanence, and for the first time, a different thought formed, sharp and clear. If I was no longer family when it came to presents, then perhaps I didn't need to be family when it came to responsibility either. I didn't make any dramatic gestures that night. I didn't send a message. I didn't confront anyone. I closed my laptop, washed my mug, and went to bed earlier than usual. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it was heavy and dreamless. The next morning, I woke up with a calm that surprised me. Not peace, not yet, but clarity. I made coffee and sat back down at my desk, opening the same spreadsheets I had been working on the night before. The numbers were still there, waiting, obedient as ever. Accounts, permissions, transfers, obligations assumed rather than acknowledged. I scrolled slowly, not changing anything, just looking. It struck me how invisible this work had become, how natural it was for everyone to assume it would always exist, like electricity or running water. You only notice it when it stops. I rested my hands on the keyboard and took a breath. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning revenge. I was doing something far more unsettling than that. I was deciding to stop holding things together that I had never been thanked for holding in the first place. I didn't shut anything down yet. Not that morning, not that day. I needed to understand the full picture before I moved. Years of managing finances had taught me that impulsive actions created messes that took twice as long to clean up. Whatever I did next needed to be deliberate. But something fundamental had already shifted. The text message hadn't just uninvited me from a wedding. It had stripped away an illusion I didn't realize I was still carrying. The illusion that love and responsibility were always reciprocated. That sacrifice guaranteed belonging. I looked at my phone once more, still face down where I had left it. No new messages, no follow-up, no second thought from anyone on the other end. That silence told me everything I needed to know. They believed I would swallow this the way I had swallowed everything else. Quietly, gracefully, without consequence. They forgot one thing. I wasn't just the daughter they could exclude. I was the one who held the keys. After my mother's funeral, the house felt too large for the three of us. Her voice was gone, her routines erased, but the space she had held didn't disappear. It hovered, waiting to be filled. My father moved through the rooms like a guest who had overstayed, opening drawers without knowing what he was looking for, standing in doorways as if expecting instructions that never came. My sister stayed in her room, door closed, grief leaking out in quiet bursts of anger and silence. And I stood in the kitchen, staring at a stack of bills my mother had always paid on time, realizing that if I didn't pick them up, no one else would. There was no meeting where we discussed this. No moment where my father looked at me and said, "I need you to take over." It simply happened. I logged into accounts. I called the bank. I asked questions I had never needed to ask before. I told myself it was temporary, that we just needed to get through the first year. Grief does strange things to time. 1 year became 2, then 5, then a decade before I realized I had built an entire life around holding things together. At the time, I still had options. I had just been offered a role at work that would have put me on a clear path upward. More responsibility, more pay, more travel. I remember sitting at my desk after hours. The office lights dimmed, weighing the email on my screen against the image of my father alone at the dining table, staring at paperwork he didn't understand. I told myself there would be other opportunities. I told myself family came first. I told myself I could do both. I was wrong about that last part. I turned down the promotion. I asked for flexible hours instead. I began leaving work early to meet contractors, talk to accountants, handle issues that had nothing to do with my job description but everything to do with my life. My colleagues moved on. I stayed. I didn't feel noble about it. I felt necessary. Money became the language I spoke most fluently. I built systems because chaos terrified me. Separate accounts for specific purposes, emergency funds, education savings for my sister, a buffer for the business my father insisted on keeping, even though he rarely involved himself in its daily operations. On paper, he was the owner. In practice, I was the one who negotiated contracts, handled payroll, filed taxes, and made sure no one noticed how close things came to falling apart during slow months. I never hid this from them. There was nothing secret about what I did, but there was also no ceremony acknowledging it. No point where my role was formally recognized. It simply became the background hum of our lives, something they relied on without consciously seeing. My sister benefited the most from that stability. She was younger, still figuring herself out, and I wanted her to have choices I hadn't taken. I paid her tuition without hesitation. When she wanted to study abroad for a semester, I made the numbers work. When she called in a panic because her car broke down, I handled it before my father even knew there was a problem. She thanked me sometimes. More often, she just assumed I would say yes. My father, for his part, grew comfortable. He trusted me completely, which on the surface felt like respect. But trust can slide into abdication without anyone noticing. He stopped reviewing statements. He signed documents without reading them closely. When I tried to walk him through decisions, he waved me off. "You're better at this," he'd say. "Just tell me what to sign." I told myself that was fine. I told myself I didn't need his involvement, that efficiency mattered more than ego. But over time, something subtle shifted. The business wasn't his anymore in anything but name, yet he still introduced it as his own. The family finances ran through my hands, yet no one ever referred to them as mine. I was the operator, not the owner. The engine, not the driver. For years, that distinction didn't bother me. I had convinced myself that contribution was its own reward, that keeping things stable was enough. I didn't need recognition because I didn't need validation, or so I believed. Looking back now, I can see how dangerous that mindset was. There were small moments I ignored because they didn't seem worth addressing. Times when my sister made plans assuming I would pay. Times when my father promised things without checking with me first. Little comments that framed my role as automatic rather than chosen. I brushed them aside because confronting them felt petty. I didn't want to be the person who counted favors or tallied sacrifices. I wanted to believe that love meant giving freely. But giving freely only works when everyone involved understands that it is, in fact, a gift. When giving becomes expected, it stops being generosity and starts being extraction. The first time I truly felt invisible was over something trivial. A family dinner where they discussed a potential expansion for the business. New equipment, new space, new expenses. I listened quietly, waiting for someone to ask what I thought, knowing the numbers in my head didn't support their enthusiasm. No one did. The conversation moved on as if I weren't there. When I later mentioned a concern, my sister laughed lightly and said, "We already talked about it." It's fine, we hadn't talked about it. They had. That should have been my warning. Instead, I adjusted. I always adjusted. I reviewed the finances alone and made quiet changes to accommodate decisions I hadn't been part of. I told myself this was what support looked like. This was how families worked. Someone led, someone followed, and I had chosen my place. When my sister met her fiancé, the pattern accelerated. He was interested in the family business from the start. Asked questions that went beyond polite curiosity, wanted to know margins, assets, future plans. I answered carefully, aware now of how much information I carried. I assumed he was trying to understand what he was marrying into. I didn't consider that he might be calculating what could be leveraged. As wedding plans began to take shape, I noticed my access shifting. Emails stopped, including me. Decisions appeared fully formed, presented as updates rather than discussions. When I asked about budgets, the answers were vague. "Don't worry," my sister said. "We're not asking you to pay for everything." I hadn't offered. I hadn't been asked. Yet the assumption lingered, unspoken but heavy. The night before my father sent that text, I had reviewed the family accounts as I always did. Everything looked normal on the surface, but something felt off. A transaction delay here. A document uploaded without my knowledge there. Nothing concrete enough to confront, but enough to unsettle me. I made a note to look more closely the next day. Instead, I woke up to being told not to come to my own sister's wedding. Sitting alone in my office after reading that message, memories flooded back with a clarity that surprised me. The years of quiet responsibility. The choices I had made under the belief that I was building something shared. The way my role had shifted from valued to invisible without my noticing the exact moment it happened. I realized then that the problem wasn't that my family no longer needed me emotionally. That was normal, even healthy. The problem was that they still needed me financially, but no longer felt the need to treat me as family while doing so. That imbalance had been growing for years, demonstrated in 1,000 small ways I had ignored, because they didn't fit the story I told myself about who I was and why I mattered. I closed my eyes and let that truth settle. It didn't make me angry, it made me tired. I had spent so long being the person who fixed things that I had forgotten to ask myself what it was costing me. Not in money, but in time, in identity, in the quiet erosion of my own life. I had postponed dreams, relationships, rest, all in service of a stability that now seemed to exist independently of my presence, at least in their minds. But the numbers told a different story. They always do. As I reopened my spreadsheets, not to act but to observe, I understood something fundamental. The systems I had built weren't just conveniences. They were supports. Remove them, and everything above would wobble. Not out of malice, not out of revenge, but out of simple cause and effect. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't scheming, I was acknowledging reality. For the first time since my mother's death, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had never entertained. What would happen if I stopped? Not walked away dramatically. Not burned bridges. Just stopped carrying everything that no one had noticed me carrying at all. That thought didn't frighten me the way I expected it to. Instead, it brought a strange sense of relief. As if a door I hadn't known existed had quietly unlocked. They believed I was part of the furniture, permanent, reliable, unchanging. They had forgotten that even the strongest structures fail when the foundation is removed, and I was finally ready to let them feel the weight they had been standing on all along. The first time I met my sister's fiancé, I told myself not to overthink it. He arrived with flowers, shook my father's hand firmly, and smiled in a way that suggested confidence without arrogance. He asked about my work, listened carefully, and nodded at the right moments. On the surface, there was nothing to dislike. If anything, he seemed eager to fit in. Too eager, perhaps, but I brushed that thought aside. Love makes people curious. That was what I told myself. It wasn't until later that I replayed the conversation in my head and realized what he had been curious about. Not my sister's childhood, not how we had coped after our mother died, not what kind of family traditions mattered to us. He wanted to know about the business, about how long it had been running, about whether it owned or leased its equipment, about whether my father planned to retire someday. The questions were casual, wrapped in friendly conversation, but they landed with precision. I answered politely and vaguely, the way you do when you're not sure why someone is asking. My sister beamed beside him, clearly proud, clearly happy. I didn't want to puncture that happiness with suspicion. So I smiled, changed the subject, and told myself I was imagining things. After that night, small shifts began to appear everywhere. Conversations happened without me. Plans were made and announced rather than discussed. I would hear about decisions after they had already been agreed upon, usually framed as something that didn't concern me. It was subtle enough to ignore, and for a while I did. I told myself I had trained them to be independent, that this was the result of years of stability, that I should be glad they no longer needed my constant input. But independence doesn't usually look like exclusion. It looks like transparency. This felt different. One afternoon I received an email about a vendor meeting scheduled for the following week. It wasn't addressed to me directly. I was copied in at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. When I opened the thread, I realized the conversation had been going on for days. My sister, her fiancé, and my father had been discussing costs, timelines, and commitments. Numbers were being thrown around casually, as if they were suggestions rather than obligations. No one had asked whether they were feasible. No one had asked me. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my cursor hovering over the reply button. I could jump in. I could correct assumptions, offer clarity, prevent mistakes. That was my role, after all. But something stopped me, a quiet, uncomfortable awareness that my involvement was no longer assumed in the same way it used to be. I wasn't being looped out because they forgot. I was being looped out because they believed they didn't need me. That realization stung more than I expected. When I asked my sister about it later, keeping my tone light, she shrugged. "We didn't think it was a big deal," she said. "You're busy. We're just figuring things out ourselves." There was no malice in her voice, but there was something else. Distance. A subtle line drawn where there hadn't been one before. My father echoed the same sentiment when I mentioned it to him. He waved his hand dismissively as if I were worrying over nothing. "They're adults now," he said. "Let them handle it. You don't need to manage everything." The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. Manage everything. As if the systems I ran operated themselves. As if money appeared out of thin air. As if responsibility were an instinct I couldn't turn off. I tried to step back, truly. I didn't comment on budgets unless asked. I didn't volunteer opinions. I watched, and what I saw unsettled me. My sister began referring to family resources as if they were communal by default. Our accounts, our assets, our safety net. She spoke with confidence, but not understanding. There was no awareness of how those resources were structured, where they came from, or what would happen if they were misused. It was as if the existence of stability had convinced her that stability was permanent. Her fiancé encouraged this framing. I noticed how often he used inclusive language when discussing finances, positioning himself as already inside the circle. "When you're married," he said once, "it all becomes shared anyway." The comment was casual, almost joking, but it lodged itself in my mind. Marriage didn't magically rewrite legal boundaries. It didn't erase names on accounts or obligations attached to signatures. But the way he spoke suggested he believed otherwise. Or perhaps he believed that belief alone was enough to make it true. The first real warning came in the form of a document my father asked me to review. He had already signed it. A minor authorization related to the business, he said. Just routine. When I read through it, my stomach tightened. The language was broader than it needed to be. The permissions extended further than I was comfortable with. When I pointed this out, my father frowned, confused. He hadn't noticed. He trusted that it was fine. "Who prepared this?" I asked. "My sister's fiancé," he replied. He said it was standard. I corrected the document immediately, but the unease lingered. It wasn't that anything disastrous had happened. It was that someone else was beginning to shape the framework I had spent years building, and they were doing it without my involvement. I started paying closer attention after that. Not interfering, not confronting, just observing. Patterns emerged quickly once I looked for them. Information flowed around me instead of through me. Decisions were justified after the fact. When I questioned timelines or costs, the answers were impatient, as if my concern were an obstacle rather than a safeguard. One evening, while reviewing my inbox, I noticed an email thread about the wedding budget. It had been forwarded to me accidentally. The sender was my sister's fiancé. The recipients included a financial consultant I didn't recognize. My name appeared in the body of the message, not as a recipient, but as a reference point. "She handles the accounts," the message read. "We'll need access once everything is finalized." Access. The word sat there on the screen, unblinking. There was no request, no conversation, just an assumption, stated plainly, as if it were already agreed upon. I closed the email without responding and leaned back in my chair, my heart beating faster than it should have been. For the first time, I allowed myself to entertain a thought I had been resisting. This wasn't just about a wedding. It wasn't just about family dynamics shifting as children grew up and moved on. There was something more deliberate happening beneath the surface. When I spoke to my sister later that week, she was distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. When I asked her about the consultant, she waved it off. "He's just helping us plan," she said. "You don't have to worry about it." I didn't tell her that worry had already taken root. The night before my father sent the text, I sat alone at my desk, reviewing recent activity across our accounts. Everything appeared normal at first glance. No missing funds, no unauthorized transfers. But there were small inconsistencies, delays, attempts that hadn't gone through, changes requested and then withdrawn. It was as if someone were testing the system, probing gently to see where resistance lay. I made a note to investigate further in the morning. Instead, I woke up to being told not to come to my sister's wedding. As I stared at that message, all the scattered moments of the past months aligned into a single coherent picture. The exclusion, the assumptions, the language of access, the quiet reshaping of boundaries I had never agreed to move. They hadn't pushed me out emotionally first. They had pushed me out procedurally, removed me from conversations, reduced my visibility, framed my role as optional. And now, with the wedding approaching, they no longer needed the pretense of inclusion at all. I understood then why the message came from my father instead of my sister. He was the buffer, the messenger, the one whose authority made the decision sound final, unquestionable. It was easier than confronting me directly, easier than explaining motives that might not survive scrutiny. Standing in my kitchen that morning, phone still in my hand, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not heartbreak. Awareness. I had been replaced, not because I failed, but because my presence complicated something they wanted to do. My oversight made certain actions impossible. My involvement required explanation, transparency, consent, and so they had decided I didn't need to be there. I set the phone down slowly, every instinct screaming to respond, to demand clarity, to reassert my place. Instead, I listened to the quieter voice beneath the noise, the one that had been growing louder with every ignored email and signed document I hadn't seen. If they believed my absence would make things easier, then perhaps it was time to let them experience what that absence actually meant. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but as truth. Because families don't collapse when someone leaves the room. They collapse when the person holding them together is quietly removed, and no one notices until the structure begins to shake. And it was already shaking. I didn't make the decision all at once. That's the part people never understand when they hear what I did next. They imagine a dramatic moment, a slammed door, a declaration fueled by anger. The truth was quieter, slower, more deliberate, the kind of decision that forms after every other option has already been exhausted in silence. The morning after my father's message, I went through my routine as if nothing had happened. Coffee brewed, laptop opened, calendar checked. Habit is a powerful thing. For years, my mornings had been built around responsibility, and muscle memory doesn't vanish overnight. But something was different this time. I wasn't scanning for problems to solve. I was scanning to observe. Emails came in as usual. Vendor confirmations, bank notifications, a reminder about a quarterly filing. Normally, I would have responded immediately, adjusting, correcting, smoothing things over before they could become issues. That morning, I read them without replying. I marked them. I archived them. I let them sit. There was a strange sense of detachment in doing that, like watching a machine run without touching the controls. I realized how much of my life had been spent anticipating other people's needs before they ever voiced them. I knew what would break before it broke. I fixed things before anyone knew they were broken. And because of that, no one truly understood how fragile the system was without me. By midday, my phone buzzed. A text from my sister. It was short, almost casual. "Can you forward me the login for the wedding account? We need to finalize something." I stared at the message for a long moment, not because I was tempted to answer, but because of how easily it assumed compliance. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of what had happened the day before, no recognition of the fact that I had just been uninvited from one of the most significant moments of her life. The request floated there, detached from context, as if nothing else mattered. I didn't reply. The silence wasn't meant to be cruel, it was meant to be honest. For the first time, I was responding to how I felt rather than how I was expected to behave. In the afternoon, my father called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. A few minutes later, a voicemail appeared. His voice sounded confused, not angry. He asked if I'd seen an email from the bank. Something about a delayed transfer. He assumed it was a technical glitch. He asked me to look into it when I had time. I listened to the message twice, then set the phone down. This was the moment I had been moving toward without fully admitting it to myself. The moment where my absence stopped being theoretical and started becoming tangible. The system I had built was already responding to the change, small disruptions rippling outward. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt confirmation. That evening, I sat at my desk with my laptop open, not to fix anything, but to prepare. Years of experience had taught me that stepping away without structure created chaos that could hurt people who didn't deserve it. If I was going to stop, I needed to do it cleanly, legally, quietly. I began by documenting everything. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. Accounts I had access to, roles I filled, permissions I held. I made a list, methodical and precise. It was longer than I expected. Some of the entries surprised even me, responsibilities I had absorbed so gradually that I had forgotten they weren't originally mine. As I worked, another realization surfaced, heavier than the first. Much of what I managed was tied to my name, my authorization, my oversight. Without me, there was no backup plan. No one had been trained to step in, not because I was controlling, but because no one had ever asked to learn. That knowledge sharpened my resolve. This wasn't abandonment, this was correction. The next day, I took a day off work. Not to rest, but to think. I went for a long walk through my neighborhood, letting my thoughts settle into something clearer. The anger I had expected never arrived. In its place was a deep, steady sadness. Not for what was happening now, but for how long it had been happening without me noticing. I thought about my mother often during that walk. About how she had carried so much without complaint. About how her strength had become invisible because it was constant. I wondered if this was how she had felt sometimes, watching her efforts be absorbed into normalcy, unremarked and unchallenged. I stopped at a park bench and sat down, letting the weight of that settle. I understood then that this wasn't just about my sister or my father or the wedding. It was about a pattern that would continue as long as I allowed it. If I stepped back now, painfully and imperfectly, there was a chance it could change. If I didn't, I would simply be replaced again the next time my presence became inconvenient. When I returned home, there were 3 new messages waiting. One from my sister, more urgent now. One from my father asking if I was upset. One from her fiancé, carefully worded and polite, asking if we could talk about some financial details. That message sealed it. I read it slowly, noting the phrasing, the assumptions tucked neatly between the lines. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the tension. He went straight to logistics, to access, to timing, as if my role in all of this had always been purely functional. I closed my inbox and opened a new document. This one wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a simple outline of boundaries. I would no longer manage day-to-day family finances. I would no longer authorize transfers on behalf of anyone else. I would no longer serve as the silent guarantor behind decisions I hadn't agreed to. I would transition responsibilities back to their legal owners in an orderly way. Not immediately, not dramatically, but decisively. The fear came later that night, creeping in when the house was quiet and the momentum slowed. What if I was wrong? What if this destroyed relationships that couldn't be repaired? What if I was overreacting to hurt feelings and reading intention where there was none? I let those questions exist without answering them. Experience had taught me that doubt always arrived when you stopped serving other people's expectations. That didn't make it a sign you were wrong. I slept poorly, but when morning came, my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. I started with the smallest step. I removed myself from one shared calendar, then another. I updated contact information so notifications would go to my father instead of me. Each action felt oddly ceremonial, like placing stones on a path I had walked for too long without realizing I could choose another direction. By the end of the day, the shift was complete enough to be felt but not yet understood. No alarms had gone off. No confrontations erupted. Just a subtle change in how things moved. That night, my sister sent another message. "Why aren't you responding? We need this handled today." I typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't accuse. I simply didn't respond. Silence, I was learning, wasn't weakness. It was space. Space for truth to surface without interference. Space for people to feel the weight of what they had been leaning on without noticing. I went to bed knowing that the consequences of this choice hadn't arrived yet. They would come soon. I could feel them gathering, like pressure building behind a door that had been held shut for years. But for the first time since my mother died, I felt something else alongside the fear: relief. Because whatever happened next, it would finally be real. The silence didn't last as long as I thought it would. It never does when people are used to being carried. The first cracks appeared quietly, disguised as inconveniences, the kind everyone assumes will be fixed by someone else. Normally, that someone would have been me. I woke early the next morning and checked my phone out of habit. No missed calls overnight, no frantic messages yet. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window while the sky lightened. For years, this hour had been my buffer zone, the time I used to scan ahead, anticipate problems, prevent them from reaching anyone else. That morning, I did none of that. I let the day arrive without interference. By 9, my inbox began to fill. The first email was from the bank. Polite, automated, neutral. A scheduled transfer had not gone through. Insufficient authorization, it said. Please contact the account administrator. I read it once, then closed it. 10 minutes later, another notification followed. A payment related to the family business had been delayed pending review. Normally, I would have called immediately, smoothed it out, made sure the vendor never noticed. Instead, I watched the message disappear into the archive folder. The strangest part wasn't the anxiety I expected to feel. It was how calm I remained, almost detached, like a doctor observing symptoms rather than panicking at the diagnosis. At 11, my father called again. I let it ring. Then again. The third time, I listened to the voicemail. He sounded unsettled now. Not angry, not accusatory, just confused. He mentioned the bank email, the delayed payment, the vendor who had called asking questions he didn't know how to answer. He laughed nervously at the end, trying to lighten the moment. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said. "You'll take a look, right?" I didn't return the call. By early afternoon, the ripple had reached the wedding planning. My sister texted me 3 times in quick succession, each message more urgent than the last. "Did you change something? The florist says they can't confirm. Why isn't the deposit going through?" I stared at the messages without replying. They weren't accusatory yet. They still carried the assumption that I was involved, that I was somewhere in the background handling things. The realization that I hadn't reached her yet. That came later. Around 3, an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. I answered this one. "Hello," the voice said brightly. "This is the coordinator for your sister's wedding venue. We're just following up on an outstanding payment. We've been unable to process it and wanted to make sure everything is okay." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I'm no longer the contact person for that account," I said. "You'll need to reach out to the account holder directly." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Oh," she said, "I wasn't aware. Thank you for letting me know." When the call ended, I felt something shift. This was no longer passive. My absence had been acknowledged. The machine was beginning to realize the operator had stepped away. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. My sister stopped texting. My father started. He asked where I was, asked if I was upset, asked why I hadn't responded. His messages grew longer, less certain. He mentioned that the business supplier had paused deliveries. That payroll might be affected if things weren't resolved soon. He didn't accuse me of anything directly, but the implication hung there, heavy and unspoken. I read every message. I saved some. I responded to none. That night, as I cooked dinner for myself, my phone rang again. This time, it was her fiancé. His voice was calm, professional, almost rehearsed. He said he hoped I was well, said he understood emotions were high with the wedding coming up, said he wanted to clear up a few logistical issues. "We just need to make sure everything keeps moving," he said. "This is a stressful time for everyone." I listened without interrupting. He talked about family responsibility, about teamwork, about how much this wedding meant to my sister. He didn't mention the message telling me not to attend. He didn't acknowledge the exclusion. He went straight to function, as if my value existed only in what I could facilitate. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I said only one thing. "I'm no longer managing those accounts." There was a fraction of a second where his composure slipped, just enough for me to hear it. A sharp intake of breath. A recalibration. "Oh," he said slowly. "I didn't realize that had changed." "It has," I replied. "We can talk about it," he said quickly, "maybe in person. We just need access restored temporarily. After the wedding, everything can be sorted properly. After the wedding." The phrase landed exactly where it had before. As a promise deferred. As leverage. As an attempt to move past consent by accelerating the timeline. "I'm not available for that," I said. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was tighter. "This really isn't the best time for disruptions." I ended the call without arguing. That was when the panic truly set in. Over the next 2 days, I watched the system react to my absence in real time. Payments stalled, approvals expired, emails went unanswered because they were no longer being forwarded to me. The wedding vendors grew less patient. The business supplier issued a formal notice. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to expose how dependent everything had been on a single point of control. Me. What struck me most wasn't the logistical fallout. It was the emotional one. No one asked how I was. No one acknowledged the hurt that had preceded this. Every message, every call, every attempt at contact revolved around restoring function. Fix this, resolve that, get things back on track. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand. My presence had been tolerated, even appreciated as long as it was useful. The moment it became inconvenient, I was excluded. And now that exclusion was threatening outcomes they cared about. They wanted me back, but only in my old role. On the 3rd day, I received a security alert from the bank. Multiple login attempts had been made on a family account from a device I didn't recognize. The system had flagged it and locked access pending verification. I felt a chill run through me, sharp and immediate. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't oversight. Someone was trying to force entry. I opened my laptop and pulled up the activity logs. The attempts were methodical, correct usernames, slightly incorrect passwords, adjusted incrementally. Whoever was doing this knew the structure of the accounts, knew where to look, knew what they were trying to reach. I didn't call the bank yet. I didn't alert anyone. I took screenshots. I noted timestamps. I documented everything. For the first time since I stepped back, anger surfaced. Not explosive, not loud, but focused. Cold. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. It wasn't even about family dynamics. This was about access, about control, about someone attempting to take what they believed they were entitled to, without permission, without transparency. That evening, my sister finally called. Her voice was strained, edges frayed. She asked what was going on, asked why everything was falling apart, asked why I was doing this to her. I listened until she ran out of words. Then I said quietly, "I didn't do anything. I just stopped fixing things you didn't want me involved in." She went silent. "You could help," she said finally. "You could just make this work." "I could," I agreed, "but I'm not going to." She hung up without another word. I sat alone in my living room long after the call ended, the weight of the moment settling around me. The cracks were no longer subtle. They were visible, spreading outward, forcing everyone to confront a reality they had avoided for years. Systems don't collapse because someone steps away. They collapse because they were never designed to function honestly without that person in the first place. As I closed my laptop that night, one thought crystallized with absolute clarity. When money stops flowing, truth has a way of surfacing. And whatever truth they had been trying to outrun, it was about to catch up with all of us. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was panicking, but because my mind had shifted into a mode I knew too well. The alert from the bank replayed itself over and over in my thoughts, not as fear, but as pattern. Multiple login attempts, correct usernames, incremental password changes. This wasn't someone confused or locked out. This was someone testing limits. By 3 a.m, I stopped pretending rest would come and made tea instead. I sat at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator, and opened my laptop. For years I had managed crises like this by calling people, smoothing things over, explaining. This time I did the opposite. I observed. The first thing I asked myself was simple. If I weren't here, what would they try to do? That question changed everything. I logged into the administrative dashboard for the accounts I still had access to. I didn't make changes. I didn't block anyone. I just looked. The activity logs were clean on the surface, but when I filtered by timestamps, a pattern emerged. Attempts clustered late at night, early mornings. Moments when I would normally have been asleep, when oversight would be weakest. Someone wasn't reacting impulsively. They were working around me. I pulled up older documents next, not the ones I reviewed regularly, but the ones that lived quietly in digital folders, assumed complete because they had never caused problems before. Authorizations, business filings, limited powers of attorney that had been created years earlier for convenience. I had trusted these because I had drafted them myself, or at least reviewed them closely at the time. As I opened each file, I felt a growing sense of unease. The language looked right. The formatting was familiar. But something felt off. It took me a moment to see it. A clause that hadn't been there before. A scope of authority slightly broader than necessary. Permissions that extended just a little further than I remembered agreeing to. My signature stared back at me from the bottom of the page. Except it wasn't quite mine. To anyone else it would have passed without question. Same looping initial, same slanted line. But I knew my own hand the way you know your own voice. This signature was close, but not exact. The pressure was wrong, the angle slightly off. It was a careful imitation, not a forgery done in haste. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding now. Not with fear, but with clarity. Someone had altered documents, or replaced them, or uploaded revised versions after the fact, counting on familiarity to prevent scrutiny. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intent. I checked the metadata. Modification dates told their own story. Changes made weeks ago. Quietly. During a period when wedding planning was accelerating and my involvement was already being reduced. The realization hit me slowly, like cold water spreading outward. They hadn't just wanted me out of the picture emotionally, they needed me out of the way structurally. I continued digging. Email records revealed requests for information I hadn't seen. A contact address changed briefly, then restored. A request for loan documentation started and abandoned. A draft application saved, but never submitted. All of it incomplete, as if someone were rehearsing. The name that appeared most often wasn't my sister's. It was her fiancé's. He wasn't listed as an owner. He wasn't officially authorized on most accounts. But he appeared repeatedly as a point of contact, a liaison, someone CC'd on correspondence that should never have included him. I felt disappointment then, sharp and heavy. Not surprise. Disappointment. I had suspected calculation, but seeing it laid out so plainly stripped away any remaining doubt. I checked the business records next. The small company my father owned on paper but never truly operated. Contracts had been renegotiated recently. Nothing illegal on the surface, but the terms were aggressive. Commitments extended beyond what the business could comfortably sustain. Risk introduced without discussion. Who had approved these changes? My father's name was on the documents, but the handwriting notes in the margins weren't his. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the pieces settle into place. My father hadn't been malicious. He had been careless. Trusting. He had signed what he was told was necessary, relying on the assumption that someone, somewhere, had checked the details. He hadn't realized that the person who used to do that had been quietly removed from the process. By dawn, I had a clear picture. They hadn't yet succeeded in taking anything substantial. Not money, not assets. But they were preparing, positioning, testing, and they were running out of time. The wedding was approaching, and with it, a shift in access, perception, and leverage. I understood then why everything felt rushed, why decisions were being accelerated, why exclusion had escalated to outright dismissal. Marriage wasn't the goal. It was the key. I didn't confront anyone that morning. I didn't call my father or my sister. I didn't message her fiancé. Instead, I created backups, copies of everything, stored securely with timestamps and notes. I documented discrepancies, version histories, access attempts. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was protecting myself. And, strangely enough, protecting them too, whether they realized it or not. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my sister's fiancé. "Hey, just checking in. We're running into some delays and thought you might be able to help smooth things over. It's getting stressful with the wedding so close." The tone was different now, less confident, still polite but threaded with urgency. He didn't mention access directly this time. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to a new folder and labeled it simply evidence. That word would have terrified me a week ago. It didn't now. It grounded me. As evening fell, I took a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood was quiet, lights glowing behind windows where other families moved through ordinary routines. I wondered how many of them were built on invisible labor. How many relied on one person quietly holding everything together, unacknowledged until the moment they stopped. I thought again of my mother, of how much she had carried without ever calling it a burden, of how easily strength becomes expectation when it's consistent. Back home, I sat at my desk one last time and looked at the folder of documents I had compiled. The evidence wasn't dramatic. There were no smoking guns, no single act that could be pointed to as catastrophic. It was something far more insidious than that. It was a pattern of testing boundaries, of reshaping authority, of moving pieces into place while assuming the person most likely to notice had been sidelined. I realized then that if I spoke too soon, if I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would call it misunderstanding, stress, wedding chaos. They would minimize and deflect until the truth was buried under emotion. I wasn't going to give them that opportunity. I closed my laptop and wrote myself a single note, handwritten this time, as a reminder. Do not interrupt someone while they are revealing who they are. The urge to step in, to warn, to protect was still there. It always would be. But I finally understood something I hadn't before. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is let people finish the path they've chosen, long enough for everyone to see it clearly. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But now I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew that whatever came next, I would be ready. The countdown had started, whether anyone said it out loud or not. I could feel it in the tightening tone of messages, in the way every conversation circled back to dates and deadlines. The wedding was close enough now that there was no room left for adjustments, only pressure. And pressure has a way of exposing motives people don't even realize they're hiding. I wasn't part of the planning anymore, but I didn't need an invitation to sense the urgency. It hovered over everything like a low electrical hum. My sister's social media posts grew more frequent, more performative. Countdown graphics, dress previews, captions about forever. From the outside, it looked like joy. From where I stood, it looked like someone running out of time. The first clear sign came in the form of an email that wasn't meant for me. It landed in my inbox because someone forwarded it hastily, probably without checking the recipient list. The subject line mentioned a payment deadline. The body of the message was brief and firm. If the remaining balance wasn't received within 48 hours, the venue would release the date. I read it twice, noting the amount. It wasn't small, it wasn't catastrophic either. It was exactly the kind of number that assumed a safety net existed somewhere. I closed the email and waited. The phone calls started that afternoon. Not to me directly at first, but to my father. I could tell by the way his number lit up on my screen again and again. He left voicemails this time, his voice strained, asking if I had a moment, if I could help him understand what was going on. He said things were moving faster than expected. He said people were asking questions. I listened without responding. By evening, my sister called. She sounded breathless, words tumbling over each other. She talked about stress, about how hard planning a wedding was, about how everyone was overwhelmed. She didn't mention the message telling me not to come. She didn't acknowledge the distance. She spoke as if we were still operating under the same unspoken agreement as always. "We just need things to go smoothly," she said. "You know how important this is." I let the silence stretch before answering. "Important to whom?" I asked quietly. There was a pause. "To me," she said finally. "To us." I didn't argue. I didn't point out that importance had never been reciprocated when it came to respect or inclusion. I simply said I wasn't involved anymore and ended the call. That was when her fiancé stepped fully into view. He called the next morning, his voice calm but edged with something new. Urgency, sharpened by calculation. He spoke about timelines and expectations, about how weddings couldn't be postponed without consequences, about how everyone was counting on things falling into place. I listened, noting how often he said family, how rarely he said responsibility. "We're just asking for something temporary," he said. "Access, approvals. Once the wedding is over, we can sort everything out properly. It's just easier this way." "Easier for whom?" I asked. He laughed lightly, as if I were joking. "For everyone." There it was again, after the wedding, as if marriage were a reset button, as if signatures and certificates could retroactively justify decisions made without consent. I told him no. The word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. He recovered quickly, but the mask slipped just enough for me to hear it. "You're putting us in a difficult position," he said. I didn't respond. When the call ended, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline. This was no longer subtle. The pressure was being applied directly now from the person who had the most to lose if things didn't move forward exactly as planned. Over the next few days, the urgency intensified. Vendors followed up with sharper language. Deadlines replaced requests. The tone shifted from friendly to firm. Without deposits, services would be canceled. Without confirmation, dates would be released. The wedding, once presented as an inevitable celebration, was revealing itself to be a fragile construction held together by promises and assumptions. My sister's messages grew erratic. She alternated between irritation and pleading, sometimes within the same text. She asked why I was doing this. She asked if I wanted to ruin her happiness. She asked if I couldn't just help one last time. One last time had been said to me more times than I could count. What struck me most was what she didn't ask. She didn't ask why I was hurt. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She didn't ask whether excluding me had been wrong. Every question revolved around money, timing, outcomes. I began comparing what they were saying to what I had uncovered in the documents. The urgency aligned too perfectly. The pressure points matched the gaps I had identified. The closer the wedding came, the more aggressive the attempts became. They weren't panicking because they loved each other so much they couldn't wait. They were panicking because something needed to happen before scrutiny caught up with them. Another email arrived late one night, this one from a financial advisor my sister's fiancé had consulted. It was forwarded accidentally again, the thread short and revealing. It referenced future restructuring, potential leverage, options available once marital status changed. The words were clinical, but the implication was clear. Marriage changed access. Marriage changed perception. Marriage changed who had standing to ask questions. I closed my laptop slowly, my chest tight with the weight of it. The realization was complete now, undeniable. The wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a deadline. They needed it to happen before I could step in, before my absence became permanent, before questions turned into investigations. They needed it to lock in a new normal where my objections could be framed as interference rather than protection. I understood then why they had moved to exclude me so abruptly, why the message from my father had been so final. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. The next call came from my father again, late in the evening. He sounded tired, older than he had in years. He said things were complicated. He said he didn't understand why everything was so urgent. He said he trusted me and didn't know who else to turn to. For a moment, my resolve wavered. The instinct to step in, to rescue, surged up like muscle memory. I could fix this. I could smooth it out. I could make the numbers work as I always had. But then I remembered the signatures that weren't mine, the access attempts in the middle of the night, the emails where my name was reduced to a resource. I told him gently that I wasn't managing things anymore, that I trusted him to make his own decisions, that I believed he could handle it. There was a long silence on the line. I think that was the moment he realized how much he had leaned on me without noticing. After that, the calls slowed, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper. I could feel them circling, looking for another angle, another way in. One afternoon, my sister's fiancé sent a message that was almost honest. He said the wedding couldn't be postponed. He said canceling would be embarrassing. He said people would talk. He said my sister would be devastated. What he didn't say was why postponement wasn't an option. I didn't ask. I already knew. As the days ticked down, I made a decision of my own. I wasn't going to confront them yet. Not with the evidence I had, not while everything was so volatile. I needed them to continue revealing themselves, to push far enough that the truth couldn't be denied or reframed. So I waited. I documented every message, every call, every subtle shift in tone. I noted dates and times, patterns and language. I watched as the urgency crossed a line from stress into desperation. And through it all, I stayed silent. Not because I was afraid, but because silence was the only thing left that forced them to show their hand. On the night before another major payment deadline, I sat alone in my living room, the house dark around me, and felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest. The wedding was close now. Close enough that whatever they were planning would have to happen soon. I knew then that the next move wouldn't be subtle. They couldn't afford subtle anymore. And when it came, I would be ready. Because they weren't rushing toward marriage, they were racing against exposure. And they were losing. They asked to meet on a Sunday afternoon, as if choosing a quiet day might soften what needed to be said. My father's voice on the phone was careful, measured, the way it got when he was trying to hold something together that was already slipping. He said we needed to talk, clear the air. He said things had gone too far and everyone was stressed. He didn't ask me to fix anything, not directly. That alone told me how serious it had become. I agreed to come over. I arrived with a thin folder tucked under my arm. It wasn't dramatic. No thick binders, no theatrics, just enough paper to tell the truth. My hands were steady as I walked up the familiar path to the house where I had spent so much of my life carrying weight no one saw. Inside, the atmosphere was tense in a way that had nothing to do with raised voices. My sister sat rigid on the couch, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her fiancé stood near the window, arms crossed, posture relaxed in a way that felt rehearsed. My father hovered between us, trying to look calm and failing. We exchanged brief greetings. No hugs, no warmth, just politeness stretched thin. My father started first. He spoke about misunderstandings, about pressure, about how weddings brought out the worst in people. He said family shouldn't let money come between them. He said we needed to move forward and stop letting things spiral. My sister nodded silently beside him. No one mentioned the text telling me not to come to the wedding. No one acknowledged how we had gotten here. The conversation was already trying to skip to resolution without ever touching truth. I let him finish. Then I set the folder down on the coffee table. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened it and slid the first page forward. "This is a revised authorization," I said calmly. "It was uploaded 3 weeks ago. I never signed it." My sister frowned, leaning forward. Her fiancé didn't move. "That's not true," he said smoothly. "Everything was approved. Your father signed off on it." I looked at my father. He avoided my eyes. "You signed something?" I asked gently. "That expanded financial access beyond what we discussed?" He hesitated. "I didn't realize it was expanded," he said quietly. "I thought it was the same paperwork as before." I nodded, as if this confirmed something I already knew. Then I turned the page. "This is the metadata," I continued. "It shows the document was modified after the original signature. The signature matches my name, but not my hand." My sister's breath caught audibly. "That's ridiculous," her fiancé snapped, irritation finally bleeding through. "You're reading too much into this. These systems glitch all the time." "They don't," I replied. "Not like this." I slid another page forward. "These are login attempts on family accounts, late night, early morning, from devices that don't belong to me or our father. They stopped only when the system locked access. The room went very still." My father stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. My sister looked from him to me, confusion spreading across her face. "What is this?" she asked softly. "It's a pattern," I said, "one that started when I was removed from conversations and accelerated as the wedding approached." Her fiancé straightened, anger replacing calculation. "You're accusing me of something serious," he said, "without proof." I met his gaze evenly. "This is proof, not of theft, not yet, of intent, of preparation, of access being tested without consent." My father finally spoke. "Why would anyone do that?" I didn't answer him immediately. I let the silence do the work. Then I turned to my sister. "Did you know," I asked her, "that there was a draft loan application created in our family account system? It was never submitted, but it was saved. Your fiancé's contact information was listed." Her head snapped toward him. "What loan?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. It was nothing, he said quickly. Just exploring options. Planning ahead. Planning what? I asked. The wedding, he shot back. Things get expensive, you know that. I nodded slowly. I do. That's why I was careful. That's why access mattered. That's why this should have been discussed, not hidden. My sister stood abruptly. Are you saying he tried to use family money without telling us? No, I said gently. I'm saying he tried to make it possible. She turned fully toward him now. Did you do this? He laughed sharply, but there was no humor in it. You're letting her manipulate you. She's always been controlling. She can't stand not being in charge. I felt the familiar sting of that word, but it no longer held power. Control is knowing what's happening with your own finances, I said. What's happening here isn't control. It's secrecy. My father sank into a chair, hands trembling. I trusted you, he said to the man my sister planned to marry. I trusted both of you. We didn't do anything wrong, her fiancé insisted. Everything was for the family, for the future. For whose future? I asked quietly. That was when the excuses began to unravel. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how everyone expected him to provide. He said he felt judged, sidelined, treated like an outsider. He said marriage would make things clearer, easier, that once they were officially family, these boundaries wouldn't matter as much. That's when I stopped him. That sentence, I said. That's the problem. He stared at me. Boundaries always matter, I continued, especially when money is involved. Especially when trust is involved. Marriage doesn't erase consent. It doesn't retroactively justify secrecy. My sister's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away this time. She looked at him. You said everything was handled, she whispered. You said it was fine. He reached for her arm. It is fine. She's blowing this up. We just needed time. Time to do what? I asked. He didn't answer. I closed the folder and stood. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to be clear. I will not manage family finances anymore. I will not authorize access. I will not guarantee loans or cover gaps. That decision isn't punishment. It's a boundary. My sister let out a small, broken sound. What about the wedding? I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the ache of loving someone who was finally seeing too much, too late. The wedding can still happen, I said softly, but it will happen without my involvement. Or it won't happen at all. Her fiancé stood rigid, fury barely contained. You're doing this to sabotage us. No, I replied. I'm doing this so I can sleep at night. My father looked up at me then, eyes wet. You've been protecting us all this time, haven't you? I didn't answer that either. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. I walked out a few minutes later, leaving them in the living room with the papers spread between them like a mirror they hadn't wanted to look into. As I drove away, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Calls, messages. I didn't check them. I already knew what they would say. They would argue, they would blame, they would plead, they would try to bargain. But the truth was already on the table now, and it didn't care how uncomfortable it made anyone feel. For the first time, I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't fixed anything, hadn't absorbed the fallout. I had simply told the truth and walked away. Whatever happened next was no longer something I could prevent. And for once, that wasn't a failure. It was freedom. The wedding didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled thread by thread, quietly at first, the way structures do when the support holding them up has already been removed. From the outside, it probably looked like bad luck. From the inside, it felt inevitable. The morning after the confrontation, I woke to a stillness that felt heavier than silence. No phone vibrating on my nightstand, no urgent emails waiting to be answered. I made coffee slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of my apartment, and wondered how long it would take before reality reached them. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, my father called. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail. His voice sounded tired, stripped of the confidence he usually carried when he talked about family matters. He said the venue had called again. They needed confirmation by the end of the day, or they would release the date. He said he didn't understand why things were suddenly so rigid. He said he wished my mother were still here, because she would know what to do. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand, and felt a familiar ache rise in my chest. For a brief moment, the instinct to step in surged back to life. I could make one call. I could smooth it over. I could buy them time. I didn't. That afternoon, the florist followed through on their warning. Without the remaining deposit, they canceled the order. No centerpieces, no arrangements, no arch of flowers my sister had pinned on her inspiration board months ago. When the notification came through, it wasn't dramatic. Just a short email stating policy and wishing them well. The caterer was next. Then the rental company. Chairs, linens, lighting, all released back into inventory for other events. Each cancellation was polite, professional, and final. The wedding, which had once felt like an unstoppable train barreling toward a celebration, was suddenly fragile, its momentum gone. My sister called me late that evening. Her voice was raw, edges frayed. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse, she sounded lost. "They're canceling everything," she said, "one by one. I don't know what to do." I leaned back against the counter, eyes closed. I knew what she wanted me to say. I knew what she expected. That I would tell her it was okay, that I would step in, that I would fix it. Instead, I asked her a question I had never asked before. "What are you going to do?" There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her breathing, uneven, shallow. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. But I didn't offer solutions. She hung up soon after, the silence between us heavier than any argument we had ever had. The next day, the business took its turn. A supplier called my father to say they were suspending service until outstanding balances were addressed. Payroll was coming up, and the numbers didn't add up without intervention. My father tried to handle it himself. I could tell by the way his messages became more frequent, more uncertain. He asked questions he had never needed to ask before. How do we move money between accounts? Why does this require approval? Who set this up? I listened to the confusion in his voice and felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. This was what it looked like when responsibility returned to its rightful owner. Not graceful, not immediate, but necessary. Meanwhile, my sister's fiancé changed. The polite patience he had shown in earlier conversations evaporated. His messages grew shorter, sharper. He complained about embarrassment, about reputations, about how people would talk if the wedding didn't happen as planned. "This is a disaster," he said in one message. Everything was supposed to be set. I read that line several times. Everything was supposed to be set, as if outcomes existed independently of consent, as if plans, once made, were entitled to completion. Later that afternoon, my sister showed up at my door unannounced. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence cracked open by reality. No makeup, no rehearsed composure, just exhaustion and fear. I let her in without a word. She sat on the edge of my couch, twisting her hands together. "He's furious," she said quietly. "He says this never would have happened if you hadn't interfered." I didn't react. I waited. "He says you did this on purpose," she continued, "that you wanted to humiliate us, that you wanted control." I met her eyes then, steady and calm. "Do you believe that?" She hesitated. Tears welled up, spilling over before she could stop them. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted. "I thought everything was handled. I trusted him." I nodded. "Trust doesn't fail loudly," I said. "It fails quietly, until it's too late." She stayed for a while, crying, talking in circles, trying to make sense of things that no longer fit together. I listened. I didn't lecture. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't offer to save the day. When she finally left, it was with no clear plan and no easy answers. 2 days later, the venue officially released the date. The wedding was canceled. There was no announcement, no dramatic fallout on social media, just a quiet message sent to guests saying plans had changed. Some expressed sympathy. Others asked questions no one knew how to answer. The silence that followed was deafening. That was when my sister's fiancé began to pull away. He stopped showing up at family gatherings, stopped answering calls. When he did respond, it was with vague explanations about needing space, about pressure being too much, about needing to rethink everything. The wedding wasn't the only thing collapsing. The relationship was cracking under the weight of exposure. One evening, my father came to my place alone. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped in a way I hadn't seen since my mother's funeral. He sat across from me at the table, hands folded, and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he sighed. "I didn't know how much you were doing," he said. "I thought I did, but I didn't. I let myself believe everything was fine because it was easier than learning how to handle it myself." I listened without interrupting. "I should have protected you," he continued. "Instead, I let you protect all of us." The words landed softly, but they stayed. I didn't forgive him in that moment. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Understanding was. As the days passed, the consequences settled in. Bills had to be renegotiated. Contracts had to be reviewed. My father had to ask for help outside the family for the first time. My sister had to face the reality that love built on assumptions and secrecy didn't hold up under pressure. And I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, with a quiet, steady acceptance. The wedding hadn't been destroyed by my silence. It had been exposed by it. What collapsed wasn't a celebration, but a structure built on shortcuts and unspoken expectations. One evening, as I sat alone on my balcony watching the sun dip below the buildings, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister. "It's over," she wrote. "He left." I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "I'm here if you need me," I typed. "Not as your safety net, as your sister." She didn't reply right away. But she didn't argue either. As night settled in, I reflected on how close I had come, so many times, to stepping in and preventing this outcome. How easily I could have paid, signed, approved, smoothed everything over. The wedding would have happened. The photos would have been beautiful. The cracks would have been hidden. And the damage would have been permanent. Instead, the collapse had been loud enough to force truth into the open. I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. Because for the first time in a very long time, the consequences belonged to the people who had made the choices. And that, I realized, was what accountability actually looked like. The wedding hadn't fallen apart because I withdrew. It fell apart because it was never built on solid ground to begin with. And now, finally, everyone could see it. The days after the wedding was canceled moved slowly, like the world had shifted into a lower gear and no one knew how to accelerate again. There was no explosion, no dramatic confrontation that wrapped everything up neatly. Just a long, uncomfortable quiet where everyone was forced to sit with the consequences of choices they could no longer undo. My father called less often now. When he did, his voice was different, cautious, measured. He asked questions he had never asked before, not because he wanted to pull me back into my old role, but because he genuinely didn't know what to do. For the first time, he wasn't assuming I would step in. He was trying to understand. The family business became the most immediate pressure point. Without my daily oversight, small problems stacked up quickly. Invoices went unpaid because my father didn't recognize which ones were urgent. A vendor threatened to walk unless terms were renegotiated. Payroll loomed like a shadow at the end of the week. I watched it all unfold from a distance, not interfering, not celebrating the struggle, just observing what happened when responsibility was returned to the person who legally owned it. One afternoon, my father showed up at my apartment again, papers tucked awkwardly under his arm. He looked embarrassed, like a student admitting he hadn't done the reading. "I didn't realize how much you handled," he said quietly, laying the papers on my table. I thought I understood, but I didn't. I resisted the instinct to reassure him, to say it was fine, to take the stack of documents and sort them automatically. That instinct was deeply ingrained, and letting it pass without acting on it felt almost physical, like holding back a reflex. "You can learn this," I said instead. "It's not impossible, it just takes effort." He nodded slowly. I should have learned sooner. The words weren't dramatic, but they mattered. They were an acknowledgement, however late, that the imbalance hadn't been imaginary. My sister struggled more visibly. Without the distraction of wedding planning and the presence of her fiancé, she was left alone with a reality she had avoided for months. The relationship hadn't ended cleanly. It dissolved in fragments, missed calls, half explanations. A final conversation that left more questions than closure. She oscillated between anger and shame, sometimes directing both at me. "If you had just helped," she snapped during one phone call, "none of this would have happened." I let her finish. Then I spoke calmly. "If I had helped, the wedding would have happened," I said. "But everything else would have stayed the same, including the lies." She went silent after that. Not because she agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue. A week later, she asked if I could cover a shortfall she hadn't anticipated. Just until she figured things out. Just this once. The request landed exactly where it always had. On the old assumption that I would step in to make things easier for everyone else, I said no. Not harshly, not angrily, just no. There was a pause, then a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. She accused me of abandoning her when she needed me most, of punishing her for mistakes, of choosing pride over family. The words hurt more than I expected, but I didn't let them sway me. "I'm not abandoning you," I said. "I'm just not carrying this anymore." That distinction mattered, even if she couldn't see it yet. Over the following weeks, my family tried, consciously and unconsciously, to reassign the weight back to me. Subtle comments, suggestions framed as questions, reminders of how much easier things had been before. I met each attempt with the same calm boundary. "I'm not doing that anymore." At first, the boundary frustrated them, then it confused them. Eventually, it forced adaptation. My father hired an external accountant for the business. It cost more than my help ever had, and I suspected that reality stung. But it also shifted authority out of the family dynamic and into a professional framework where expectations were clear and labor was acknowledged. My sister picked up extra hours at work. She sold things she had assumed she could keep indefinitely. She began budgeting for the first time in her adult life, not because someone told her to, but because she had to. Watching her struggle was painful, not because I regretted my decision, but because I loved her. Letting someone you love feel the consequences of their own choices goes against every instinct we're taught to have, especially as women, especially as older sisters. But I also saw something else beginning to form beneath the frustration. Agency. She stopped asking me to fix things and started asking how I had learned to handle them. The questions were tentative at first, pride still bruised, but they were real. "How did you decide what to prioritize?" she asked one evening. "How did you know what to pay first?" I answered her. Not by taking over, but by explaining. The difference mattered. For the first time, our dynamic wasn't caretaker and dependent. It was two adults learning unevenly to meet in the middle. I had my own reckoning during that time. Without the constant pull of responsibility, I was left alone with myself in a way I hadn't been for years. The quiet that once felt like relief sometimes turned into guilt. I caught myself wondering if I was being selfish, if I had gone too far, if there was a way to keep my boundaries without watching the people I loved struggle. The truth was uncomfortable. Boundaries always come with a cost. They don't just protect you, they force everyone else to adjust. I had spent so long equating my worth with my usefulness that doing less felt like failing, even when I knew intellectually that it wasn't. Untangling that belief took time. One night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same place where I had once balanced accounts and anticipated crises, and asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Who am I if I'm not the one holding everything together? The answer didn't come immediately. It emerged slowly, through small moments I hadn't had space for before. Long walks without checking my phone, evenings spent reading instead of reviewing statements, conversations that didn't revolve around problems needing solutions. I realized how much of my life I had postponed, telling myself there would be time later. Later had arrived, quietly, without announcement. My father apologized to me one evening, properly this time, not defensively, not vaguely. He acknowledged that he had leaned on me too much and protected himself from discomfort by letting me absorb it instead. "I should have stepped up sooner," he said. "I should have let you be a daughter, not a safety net." The words didn't erase the past, but they softened it. My sister didn't apologize right away. When she did, it was clumsy and incomplete, tangled with her own hurt and embarrassment. But it was a start. "I'm angry at myself," she admitted. "It's easier to blame you, but I know that's not fair. I didn't ask for more than that." As the weeks passed, life settled into a new rhythm. Not easier, not harder, just different, more honest, more balanced. The family learned, slowly and imperfectly, that choices had weight, that independence wasn't a performance, but a responsibility. That stability didn't appear by magic. Someone had always been making it happen. And I learned something too. Letting go didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped paying the price for everyone else's comfort. One evening, as I stood by my window watching the city lights come on, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. I hadn't broken my family. I had stopped holding them together at my own expense. And in doing so, I had given all of us a chance to grow up. For the first time in years, that thought didn't scare me. It felt right. I didn't expect healing to feel this quiet. I had imagined some clear moment of resolution, a conversation where everything finally made sense, where pain was neatly acknowledged and closed. Instead, healing arrived in fragments, scattered across ordinary days, almost easy to miss if I hadn't been paying attention. The first change was time. Without the constant pull of family emergencies, my days stretched in unfamiliar ways. Mornings were no longer dictated by messages marked urgent. Evenings weren't swallowed by financial reviews or problem-solving disguised as care. At first, the extra hours felt empty, like rooms stripped of furniture. I wandered through them, unsure of where to sit. Then slowly, I began filling them with things that belonged to me. I took a class after work, something I had postponed for years because it didn't serve anyone else. I started running again in the mornings, rediscovering how my body felt when it wasn't carrying constant tension. I cooked meals that took time, meals no one asked for and no one depended on. These weren't grand transformations. They were small, almost invisible acts of reclamation. But together they added up to something profound, a life that didn't revolve around being needed. My sister struggled through this phase more openly than I did. She moved back into our father's house temporarily, a decision that bruised her pride but gave her space to regroup. Without the distraction of wedding plans or the emotional intensity of her former relationship, she was left alone with her own choices and their aftermath. Some days she sounded angry when we spoke, other days exhausted, occasionally reflective. One evening, she called me late, her voice softer than it had been in months. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you," she said quietly. "Not just with money, with everything." I sat on my couch listening, letting her words come without interruption. "When you stepped back, it felt like you were abandoning me," she continued. "But now I think you were forcing me to see something I didn't want to admit." I waited. "I didn't know how to take care of myself the way you did," she said. "I thought independence meant having someone else handle the hard parts as long as I didn't have to look at them." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. It wasn't polished or defensive. It was raw, uncomfortable, and real. I didn't respond with advice. I simply said I was glad she was learning, even if it hurt. Our relationship didn't magically repair itself after that conversation. Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when it's been eroded by entitlement and silence. But something shifted. Our calls became less transactional, more human. Sometimes we talked about practical things, budgeting, work stress. Other times we talked about nothing important at all. That, I realized, was progress. My father changed too, though in subtler ways. He didn't apologize again. He didn't need to. His actions spoke more clearly than words. He stopped assuming I would step in. When problems arose, he dealt with them, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with visible frustration, but always on his own terms. He asked questions differently now, not as demands disguised as concern, but as genuine attempts to understand. One afternoon he invited me to lunch. Just lunch, no agenda, no documents tucked under his arm. We sat across from each other at a small diner, the kind we used to go to when my mother was alive. He talked about the business, not to ask for help, but to tell me what he was learning, the mistakes he'd made, the things he wished he'd understood sooner. I let him talk. At one point, he looked at me and said something that stayed with me. "You always carried more than I saw," he said. I thought strength meant not complaining. I didn't realize it also meant being tired. The acknowledgement wasn't perfect. It didn't rewrite the past. But it mattered. For the first time, I felt seen not as a resource, but as a person. The family gatherings resumed eventually, smaller and quieter than before. No big celebrations, no forced cheer, just dinners where conversations didn't orbit around money or logistics. The absence of my sister's former fiancé lingered at first, like an echo of tension that hadn't fully faded. But over time, even that faded too. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, my sister asked me a question that felt like a milestone. "How did you know when to stop?" she asked. "How did you know when helping became too much?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I didn't know at first," I said. "I just knew I was disappearing. And I realized that love shouldn't cost you your entire self." She nodded, absorbing that quietly. I realized then that my silence hadn't just forced consequences. It had created space. Space for reflection. Space for growth. Space for all of us to see the dynamics we had been trapped in without ever naming. As for me, I changed in ways that surprised even myself. I stopped apologizing for having limits. I stopped explaining my boundaries as if they needed justification. When someone asked for help now, I paused before answering, checking in with myself instead of reacting automatically. Sometimes I still helped, other times I didn't. Both choices felt equally valid. The guilt that had once followed every no began to loosen its grip. In its place grew something steadier. Self-respect. I began to understand how deeply I had been conditioned to equate sacrifice with virtue, to believe that being indispensable was the same as being loved. Untangling those beliefs wasn't quick or easy, but each day I lived differently reinforced the truth. I didn't need to be needed to matter. One evening, months after the canceled wedding, I sat alone on my balcony, watching the city lights blink on one by one. The air was cool, the noise distant. I thought about how close I had come to staying silent in the wrong way, to continuing to absorb everything because it felt safer than change. I thought about how uncomfortable it had been to let things fall apart, and I thought about how necessary it had been. The family I had now wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was more honest, less performative, more accountable. The roles were clearer, the expectations spoken rather than assumed. I had stepped back, and in doing so, I had stepped into myself. Healing, I realized, wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about refusing to return to what had harmed you just because it was familiar. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my life belonged to me again. The first anniversary of the canceled wedding passed without ceremony. No one marked it on a calendar. No reminders surfaced on social media. It arrived quietly, like most meaningful things do once the noise has faded. I noticed it only because the morning felt different, lighter somehow, as if my body remembered before my mind did. I woke early that day and made coffee, standing by the window as sunlight spilled across the floor. A year ago, I would have been bracing myself for fallout, preparing to absorb tension before it reached anyone else. That morning, there was nothing to brace for. No crisis waiting, no expectation pulling at me. That absence was the clearest measure of how much had changed. My relationship with my family had settled into something honest, if imperfect. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We also didn't keep reopening it like a wound that needed to be examined every time we spoke. There was a quiet agreement now that everyone carried their own weight. Not equally, not flawlessly, but consciously. My sister was the most changed. She had moved out of our father's house months earlier, into a small apartment she could afford on her own. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't look like the life she once imagined she would have at this stage. But it was hers. She paid her bills. She tracked her spending. She made decisions without assuming someone else would catch her if she fell. One afternoon, she invited me over for dinner. She cooked nervously, checking recipes too often, apologizing for things that didn't need apology. When we finally sat down, she looked at me across the table and smiled, a real smile this time. "I didn't think I could do this," she said. "Be on my own like this." But I am. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. "You're doing great," I told her, and I meant it. Our father had changed too, though he would never describe it that way. He spoke less about plans and more about process now. He no longer brushed off details as things someone else would handle. He paid attention. He asked questions. Sometimes he still made mistakes, but he owned them. One evening he told me something quietly, almost to himself. "Your mother would have been proud of you," he said. "Not for what you did for us, for knowing when to stop." That was the closest thing to closure I needed. As for me, my life had expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant pull of responsibility, I had space to explore who I was beyond my role in the family. I pursued work that challenged me rather than drained me. I traveled without checking my phone every hour. I formed friendships that weren't built around shared obligation. I learned to rest without guilt. The most surprising change, though, was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could endure. I stopped believing that love required sacrifice without limit. I began to recognize the quiet power in choosing myself without abandoning others. That distinction had once felt impossible. Now it felt obvious. I still helped my family when I chose to. The difference was that help came from willingness, not compulsion. From clarity, not fear of being replaced or resented. There was no longer a system to collapse if I stepped away, because the system no longer relied on one person doing everything unseen. Sometimes I thought back to the moment it all began. That single text. The blunt dismissal. "Don't come to your sister's wedding. She doesn't want to see you." At the time, it felt like rejection, like erasure. Now I saw it differently. It had been an ending, yes, but it had also been an opening. A door I hadn't known I needed to walk through. If I had argued that day, if I had pleaded or explained or tried to prove my worth, I would have stayed trapped in the same cycle. I would have remained useful and invisible at the same time. Silence had changed everything. Not the kind of silence that swallows pain and pretends nothing is wrong, but the kind that creates space. Space for truth. Space for consequence. Space for people to reveal who they are when no one is smoothing the edges for them. I used to think strength meant holding everything together. Now I know it also means knowing when to let go. Life didn't become perfect after that. It became real, messy, manageable, honest, and that was enough. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been the one quietly carrying the weight of everyone else's comfort, I want you to know this. You are not selfish for wanting relief. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. And you are not responsible for holding together systems that depend on your silence to survive. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let the truth stand on its own. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where stepping away felt impossible, but necessary? What did it cost you, and what did it give you back? Share your story in the comments. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this one. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, let me know which city you're in. It means more than you think to know how far these stories travel. Thank you for staying with me until the end. And remember, choosing yourself isn't the end of love. Sometimes it's where real healing finally begins.